Okay, looks like we're ready to go. So good afternoon. On behalf of the City of Joliet, welcome to today's Alternative Water Source Program Public Forum. The Alternative Water Source Program started in 2018. It continued into a second phase through 2019 and then continued to the current phase here in 2020. Today's forum will focus on the work completed in 2020. Today we have 4 people that are part of the presentation on behalf of the city. Myself, Jeff Freeman, will be the moderator for today's session. Allison Swisher from the city of Joliet, as well as the 2 project managers from the consultant team, Joe Johnson from Stantec and Teresa O'Grady from Crawford, Murphy and Tilley. This is intended to be a public forum. So any questions or even comments, we ask that you provide those throughout. There are many methods to provide comments, Q&A to the city online, as well as certainly through this forum. But today, as we work our way through this forum, we really would like people to provide questions or comments. The way that you do that is if you move the mouse around on the screen that you have Zoom up on, you should get your Zoom toolbar to show up. You go to the Q&A button, which is circled on the screen. You push that button and you should get a dialog box that opens up if it's not open already. At the bottom of that dialog box, there is a box that says type your question here. Again, either questions or comments. Please type that into that dialog box and then it will be submitted to the panelists. Our plan is to address that at the end. We have approximately a half hour reserved for questions, answers, and comments at the end of the presentation. We do ask that you do not use the chat box for this. The Q&A will be provided to the panelists and then it will be able to be logged so that we can provide answers to those typed out on the different forums where those answers are being provided. Today's agenda, Allison's going to start us out giving a general update on the water source program. And then Teresa is going to walk through the 2 Lake Michigan alternatives overall, the description and how they would be implemented. Joe is going to talk about the cost of each one of those alternatives as well as some comparisons along the way. And then Allison's going to close things out by bringing it all together with the risk analysis, the business case for each of the alternatives, and what the next steps are in this overall process. And then at the end, like I said, we will have the questions and answers and public comment period where all 4 of us will be available for comment and discussion. So with that, why don't we have Allison take it from here.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Really excited to see we have over 50 people registered to participate. As Jeff mentioned, our goal today is to collect your questions and answers and comments and be able to provide those to the City Council for their consideration in the selection process for the alternative water source. So again, my name is Allison Swisher. I am the Director of Public Utilities for the City of Joliet. Very excited to be sharing this update on our very important project to identify a new source of water for the city and potentially the region. The goal of our meeting is to provide a very high-level overview of the Lake Michigan water alternatives that the city has been exploring, and also kind of talk about the next steps and the selection process. So the city's current water source is well water, and we have 21 deep aquifer wells and 5 shallow aquifer wells. And every day we pump about 19 million gallons of water on average. This water is then treated at 11 water treatment plants to remove naturally occurring radium and iron before being distributed to Joliet residents through 663 miles of water main. This map shows the city's existing water system. It's important to note that water currently enters the system at multiple points throughout the city's 65 square mile service area. And when we switch to the Lake Michigan water, the water will then enter the system at a single entry point. So this will require significant improvements to the Joliet distribution system, which Teresa will discuss in more detail later on in the presentation. So what is the problem with the city's current water supply? As this graph shows, the water levels in the deep aquifer are declining. Groundwater modeling completed by the Illinois State Water Survey in 2018 and updated in 2020 indicated that the city will not be able to meet maximum day demands by 2030. It's important to know that this isn't a City of Joliet only problem. The aquifer isn't sustainable for the surrounding communities and also industries that rely on the aquifer for water supply. So fortunately, in northeastern Illinois, we have multiple water source options. This map shows the communities in blue that get water from Lake Michigan, the communities in green that rely on river water, and the communities in orange and yellow that use well water. So given the problem at hand, the city embarked on a two-phase study of alternative water sources in 2018. Phase 1 investigated all possible water source alternatives, including aquifer recharge, river sources, and Lake Michigan. These 14 alternatives were evaluated for water quality and water quantity. 5 of the water source alternatives were recommended for further evaluation during Phase 2. These alternatives included the Illinois River, Kankakee River, and 3 variations of Lake Michigan water. All alternatives were evaluated not only for a Joliet-only option, but also for a regional scenario as well. There's a lot of work and information available about the Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies, and those are available on the city's project website, rethinkwaterjoliet.org. So please go to that site if you'd like more information on the alternative water source study. So the Phase 2 study results were presented to the City Council in November 2019, and in January 2020, the City Council selected Lake Michigan as the most reliable and sustainable water source alternative for the city. The Council then directed staff to further investigate 2 of the alternatives in 2020. These alternatives are the Lake Michigan New Indiana Intake Alternative and the Lake Michigan Chicago Department of Water Management Alternative. To help guide staff and the project team as they moved forward with the alternative water source program, a strategic plan was prepared to identify the program's major objectives and goals. The city has a vision of being a leader in providing reliable and high quality water to our community. Our mission for the program is to provide this new water supply to Joliet and potentially the region by 2030. So now I'm going to get into more detail about what was the work specifically conducted during the 2020 evaluation. So the goal of this year's work was to evaluate the 2 Lake Michigan alternatives further to reduce uncertainty. To accomplish this, a team of experts comprised of engineers, attorneys, financial advisors, and public relations professionals worked to complete the tasks that are shown on this screen. This work was done in a transparent, open, and completely unbiased manner. So these tasks included development of a funding strategy to determine how the city would pay for the improvements, updating the city's rate models to identify the impact of the project on the average water customer, completing a risk analysis, retaining an advocacy firm to complete governmental outreach, conducting ongoing public outreach to engage and inform stakeholders. That work was all conducted under the heading of project oversight. Next, we moved into external coordination. We reviewed and updated water demand projections and identified Joliet only, which is a 30 MGD scenario, and regional, which is the 60 MGD demand scenarios. We submitted an application for a Lake Michigan allocation in September and currently have a pre-hearing scheduled on December 21st as the next step in that process. We completed a water audit for 2019 and developed a strategy for reducing non-revenue water to less than 10% by 2040 as required by the allocation requirements. We negotiated binding preliminary water purchase agreements with the City of Chicago and a preliminary access agreement with the City of Hammond. And lastly, we conducted significant outreach to potential regional partners to encourage development of a regional water solution. The final category of work completed in 2020 is engineering. And there was significant engineering work that included water treatment process evaluation, intake siting studies, transmission main routing, and pump station evaluation. We met with permitting agencies and owners of right-of-way to understand permitting requirements and developed a permitting plan. We also prepared construction sequencing and contracting plans to confirm the improvements could be completed by 2030. We also began the process of developing a water source transfer plan to safely switch water sources. And in addition, we evaluated long-term operations and staffing impacts and updated and improved the accuracy of the opinions of probable construction costs based upon this more in-depth engineering work. So there's a lot of work identified on this one slide, which involved thousands of hours of work and is documented in the basis of design reports and other program memos that are available on the project website. So I specifically want to highlight the extensive public outreach that was conducted during 2020 in spite of the pandemic. We hosted 3 virtual stakeholder meetings and 3 city council workshops. A monthly newsletter was published and distributed to our stakeholder list, which includes over 1,000 people. We also used the city's social media accounts and billboards to get the word out. And lastly, this month we are hosting these live virtual meetings as well as the online virtual events. And we really encourage everyone to please visit our project website for copies of all of these materials. So as I mentioned earlier, Joliet has been evaluating the new water source not only as a solution for Joliet, but potentially the region as well. At the August 25th City Council workshop, the City Council supported the project team's recommendation of moving forward with formation of a water commission. A regional solution will benefit Joliet through cost savings from economies of scale, as well as by distributing the project risk amongst multiple entities. This concept has the support of state agencies, as well as state and federal legislators. It's important to note that both the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative and the new Indiana intake alternative can be a regional solution. So this map shows the communities Joliet has been talking to about a potential regional solution. In 2021, we will work with these communities to develop the commission governance structure and costs, and we'll seek firm commitments on participation by the end of the year. So where are we at in this evaluation? The project team has prepared 2 prospectus documents, one for each alternative, that provides a high-level overview and business case for each alternative. These documents were presented to the City Council on November 19th and are available on the project website. We are currently obtaining public comment via these live meetings and the online virtual event, which will run through December 14th. So we encourage everyone to provide their comments by the 14th so they can be provided to the City Council. So identifying and implementing a new source of water is not a quick process. Regardless of the option selected, we will take every minute of the next 10 years for design and construction before the water is flowing at residents' taps by the summer of 2030. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Teresa O'Grady, who is going to discuss the 2 Lake Michigan water alternatives.
Thank you, Allison. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa O'Grady. I'm with Crawford, Murphy & Tilley, and I will start off the discussion of the 2 water source alternatives by describing each alternative and discussing the implementation of them. So the 2 alternatives for bringing Lake Michigan water to Joliet have been evaluated in 2020. The first alternative involves purchasing finished treated water from the City of Chicago and pumping it to Joliet. The second alternative involves Joliet developing an entirely new Lake Michigan water supply system through the construction of a new intake in Lake Michigan, accessed from Hammond, Indiana, and pumping raw water over 46 miles to Joliet for treatment. As Allison mentioned, both of these alternatives have been evaluated for the Joliet only 30 MGD scenario, as well as the Water Commission 60 MGD scenario. So when I refer to Joliet's improvements for each alternative, What we're talking about would apply to the Water Commission as well as Joliet if that Water Commission is formed. The first alternative that I'll talk about is the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative. This alternative involves purchasing finished treated water from the city of Chicago and pumping it to Joliet. The connection point would be at Chicago's Southwest Pumping Station. There are major improvements required at Chicago's Southwest Pumping Station to have a safe connection and take ownership of the finished water before pumping it over 30 miles to Joliet. As this alternative involves purchasing treated finished water, the city of Joliet would enter into a water supply agreement with the city of Chicago. As part of the 2020 evaluation, a preliminary water supply agreement has been negotiated with the city of Chicago. A few things to note. This is significantly different than Chicago's current water supply agreement framework, and it is significantly different than what was presented in the Phase 2 study. While I will not go into detail about the preliminary water supply agreement, I want to highlight a few key terms. First, the agreement term proposed is a 50-year agreement with evergreen 10-year renewals, which means it keeps renewing after 50 years unless one party gives notice to terminate. It also has provisions to not allow for the transfer of the agreement from Chicago to a third party unless approved by Joliet. And it has provisions that Chicago will not sell their water system unless approved by Joliet. And last but not least, we have negotiated a wholesale rate that is based on the cost of service to Joliet, which means that Joliet will only pay for the Chicago facilities attributable to water service to Joliet. So let's start at the diagram on the right side of the screen with Chicago's existing facilities that would serve Joliet. The water source would be the 68th Street and Dunn Crib in Lake Michigan, and from there the water would travel through a 14-foot tunnel to the Eugene Sawyer Water Purification Plant, where it would be treated to drinking water standards. From there it travels through the South Tunnel system to the Southwest Pumping Station. The existing Southwest Pumping Station does not have the capacity to serve Joliet, so new infrastructure is required to connect to the existing tunnel and extend it to a new low-service pump station to pump water out of the tunnel. These new facilities, shown in the dashed black line on the diagram, would be owned and operated by Chicago. After the low-service pump station, but prior to the meter vault, there would be a valve called the Chicago service valve that would be the breakpoint in ownership between Chicago and Joliet. After the Chicago service valve, there would be a meter vault before discharging the water into a suction well, which is a large underground storage tank, before it is pumped through the high service pump station and heads to Joliet. These new facilities past the Chicago service valve would be owned and operated by Joliet. All of these new facilities would be located at Chicago Southwest Pumping Station site, with the new low service pump station and new high service pump station on the south side of the site, and the new suction well in Durkin Park west of the Southwest Pumping Station. So under those, on the left-hand side of the screen, under the alternative improvements, we've talked about the improvements at the Southwest Pumping Station site. So next we'll talk about the transmission system, the Joliet water distribution system modifications, and the backup well supply on the next slide. So in this exhibit, Chicago's Southwest Pumping Station is located in the upper right-hand corner of the exhibit. All of the infrastructure outside of the Southwest Pumping Station site would be designed, constructed, owned, and operated by Joliet. From the Southwest Pumping Station, Joliet would construct a new finished water transmission main between 48-inch and 60-inch diameter, depending on capacity, approximately 31 miles to Joliet. This is shown with the blue line in the exhibit. Given the distance, there would be an intermediate pump station along the route. And then as it reached Joliet, there would be a receiving station that would serve as the entry point to the Joliet system, as well as the starting point for the Joliet distribution system modifications. The Joliet distribution system modifications are shown in red on the exhibit. These are the transmission mains required to distribute the new water source across the system for the 30 MGD scenario. As Allison had mentioned, going from multiple entry points to a single point of entry requires extensive improvements in the system. So for the 60 MGD scenario, a regional water commission network would be constructed instead of the Joliet distribution system modifications. And those are shown in the dashed green lines on the exhibit. While not shown on the exhibit, improvements also include the construction of storage and pump stations throughout the Joliet distribution system. So one thing to note here is that the city's wells would be maintained as a backup source in the event of a break in the transmission main or loss of water service from Chicago that lasts more than 2 days. So the second alternative that we're discussing is the new Indiana intake alternative. This alternative involves Joliet developing an entirely new Lake Michigan water supply system through the construction of a new intake in Lake Michigan accessed from Hammond, Indiana, and pumping raw water over 46 miles to Joliet for treatment. For this alternative, the city of Joliet would enter into an access agreement with the city of Hammond, Indiana. As part of the 2020 evaluation, a preliminary access agreement has been negotiated with the city of Hammond. And one thing to note, this is not a water purchase agreement. Joliet will not be buying raw water from Hammond. This is solely an agreement that provides Joliet with access to and use of rights-of-way and easements in Hammond-owned or Hammond-controlled property. It is a 99-year year agreement with 2 25-year renewal periods. For this alternative, several improvements are required for its implementation. So let's look at the exhibit on the right side of the slide here. The water source is a new intake crib in Lake Michigan, and that's shown in the yellow star there. From the crib, there would be a 7,000-foot intake pipe tunneled to the shore in Hammond. There would be shore facilities in Hammond consisting of screening and pumping. From the shore facilities, there would be a raw water transmission main, shown in red in the exhibit, between 48-inch and 60-inch diameter, depending on capacity, that would then travel the 46 miles to Joliet. One thing to note is that in Indiana, this raw water transmission main would be located entirely in Hammond. So in the next slide, we'll talk about, again, the raw water transmission system in Illinois, the water treatment plant, Joliet water distribution system modifications, and the backup well supply. In this exhibit, the new intake and crib is located in the upper right-hand corner of the exhibit. Once in Illinois, the raw water transmission main would continue to Joliet, and this is shown in the blue line on the exhibit. Again, there would be an intermediate pump station along the route. And then as the transmission main gets closer to Joliet, there would be a water treatment plant that would treat the raw water to drinking water standards. And this water treatment plant would utilize advanced water treatment processes capable of treatment of known emerging contaminants. The pump station at the water treatment plant will serve as the entry point to Joliet system, as well as the starting point for the Joliet distribution system modifications, again shown in red on the exhibit. And those are the transmission mains, again, to distribute the new water source across the system for the 30 MGD scenario. For the 60 MGD scenario, the Regional Water Commission network would be constructed, and that's shown in the dashed green lines on the exhibit. Again, while not shown on the exhibit, improvements also include storage throughout the system. And also for this alternative, the city's wells would be maintained as a backup source in the event of a break in the transmission main. So that talks about the description of the two alternatives. Next, I want to talk about implementation considerations. A key component of the 2020 evaluation was to look at the implementation of each alternative to make sure each could be implemented by 2030 and be online to serve the city of Joliet. We evaluated several considerations related to implementation, first of which was land acquisition. We identified sites that would have to be acquired, as well as the timing of land acquisition. For permitting, we focused on developing permitting plans and categorized them into three categories: overall permitting, site-specific permitting that would be for water facilities such as pump stations, and route-specific permitting based on the transmission main routing studies performed. Taking this into account, an implementation plan was developed for each alternative, noting design and construction, startup, commissioning, and monitoring, as well as the requirements for the water source transfer plan. In addition, staffing needs for the operation of the new infrastructure associated with each alternative was evaluated in comparison to the city's existing staffing levels. Staffing increases, if needed, were incorporated into the estimated operation, maintenance, and replacement costs for each alternative. All this was done to ensure that each alternative was feasible and could be implemented by 2030. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Johnson to talk about the costs for both alternatives.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. So my name is Joe Johnson. I'm with Stantec Consulting Services here in Chicago and another member of the project team. My goal this afternoon is to provide a summary for you of the costs that will be associated with the implementation of either of these alternatives for bringing Lake Michigan water to Joliet. So when we talk about the costs of this project, it's important to realize that there's more to that than just the capital costs of building the infrastructure. As Teresa has outlined, there are some water supply and access costs. There are certainly the capital costs and debt service associated with building and financing new infrastructure. And then there are the operation and maintenance and replacement costs associated with running the system well into the future. So we'll talk through each of these to provide a little bit of detail and perspective on how they fit into the overall cost of the project. We talk about water supply or access costs. These are the costs really associated with establishing the point of new supply for the city of Joliet. So on this chart, we've broken the costs down by the two alternatives. The columns in blue show the cost for the Lake Michigan Water, Chicago Department of Water Management alternative. And the columns in red show the cost for the new Indiana intake alternative. For the Chicago alternative, the bulk of the water supply costs are really associated with the purchase of treated water from the city of Chicago. As Teresa outlined, under this alternative, Chicago will have responsibility for supplying and treating the water for Joliet. So there's a cost associated with purchasing that treated water. There are some costs associated with engineering for some of the facilities that are required in Chicago that would be owned and operated by Chicago. So those costs are shown here. And so we have one-time costs for engineering on the order of about $7 million, and then annual payments for the purchase of water that would be about $27.5 million in 2031 for the purchase of the total amount of water required for Joliet under the 30 MGD option. And then by 2040, as the cost of water, as the rate for water increases over time, that annual purchase cost for the water would approach about $36.3 million. On the new Indiana intake alternative side of things, the access costs are slightly different. As Teresa outlined, these are not related to the purchase of water. These are related to access through the city of Hammond. So these costs and terms have been negotiated with Hammond. There would be one-time payments associated with establishment of the initial agreement. reimbursement of some of the out-of-pocket costs that are incurred by Hammond, and then provisions for right-of-way enhancement. You can imagine that the construction of several miles of large diameter transmission main through a community would result in significant disruption. Joliet's committed to making payments to Hammond to allow them to enhance the right-of-way that would be disturbed by that construction and provide some benefit to the city in return for the opportunity to put that pipeline through Hammond. Once the system is in place, there would then be annual payments associated with the water access that really relate to the continued use of property and right-of-way within Hammond. Again, the installation of large diameter pipe and construction of a new pumping station in Hammond will take up property and right-of-way that's no longer available to Hammond for installation of their own infrastructure. So there is an annual cost that's been negotiated that would be paid by Joliet to the city of Hammond for the right to have that infrastructure in their right-of-way. So these are the water supply costs. And again, a key difference here is on the Chicago alternative, these costs include costs for the annual purchase of treated water. On the Indiana alternative, the costs are primarily related to access through Hammond. So now if we talk about the capital and operating maintenance and replacement costs for the project, this chart shows costs for both the 30 MGD option at the top half of the slide and the 60 MGD regional option in the bottom half of the slide, and then costs for the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative in the blue columns and for the Indiana intake alternative in the red columns. And so capital costs for the infrastructure required to bring water to Joliet from Chicago are just under $600 million under the 30 MGD Chicago Department of Water Management alternative. The operating cost to operate and maintain those facilities, basically pipeline and pumping stations, amounts to about $4.7 million per year. When you go down in that column to the 60 MGD alternative, sorry, let me go back here for just a minute, having trouble with the slides. There we go. The total cost for the 60 MGD alternative is about $810 million to implement that infrastructure from Chicago to Joliet. And the operating and maintenance costs go up to about $6.9 million. It is important to note that while the costs go up for the 60 MGD alternative, they do not go up, they do not double. There are economies of scale as you go to the larger pipe and larger facilities. The pattern is the same on the Indiana intake alternative. The capital cost for construction of the Indiana intake infrastructure for the 30 MGD alternative are just over $1 billion. Again, in addition to the 31 miles of pipeline required for the Chicago alternative, there's about 50% more pipeline required for the Indiana intake alternative, as well as a new intake and a new water treatment plant. So the infrastructure costs are significantly higher, and the O&M costs to operate and maintain those facilities are significantly higher as well. Again, going down to the 60 MGD alternative, you see the costs go up, but again, not double with the economies of scale associated with going to a larger system. We go to the next slide. This is the same. The top half of the slide is the same. The bottom half, though, when you look at the regional alternative, the costs for the infrastructure and the operation and maintenance and replacement would be shared across not just Joliet, but also the regional partners. So Joliet's share of that cost is less. So the capital cost that's estimated to be allocated to Joliet would be about $430 million for the Chicago alternative and about $700 million for the new Indiana intake alternative. So it's of importance to note that those are actually less than the cost if Joliet were to build the infrastructure and build the system on its own. So again, as we've talked about several times, there are real economies of scale to be realized through the development of a regional alternative. The same pattern is true for the O&M and R costs. While it is a larger system, by sharing those costs across a larger customer base and a greater amount of water, the net cost to Joliet and to each of the individual partners goes down. So we've talked about the costs. Then the question comes up, how are we going to fund this work? How is Joliet going to actually finance this work and provide the funding to complete it? And the funding strategy that's been developed for the project really has three primary components. Joliet has looked at opportunities to maximize available low interest funding available through the federal government and the state government. So the WIFIA program that's shown as the top row in this chart is the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act, provides low interest funding for very large infrastructure projects like the Alternative Water Supply Program for Joliet. It provides low interest rates as well as flexibility and payback terms on that to make projects more affordable for communities. Joliet has applied for WIFIA funding, has been accepted into the program, and is on schedule to submit a loan application at the end of 2021. The WIFIA program would allow for financing of up to 49% of the total cost of the project. The second component of funding strategy is state revolving fund loan money through the Illinois EPA. Joliet has been using this money extensively for other infrastructure projects. Again, the revolving fund program is set up to provide low interest loans to water and wastewater utilities in Illinois to help them finance infrastructure projects. This would provide another source of funding, and based on discussions with IEPA, we believe it could provide as much as $50 million worth of funding a year over a 5-year period during the construction of the project. So that's a very attractive source of funding for the program. And then lastly, with each of the alternatives, there would be costs beyond those that could be funded through the low interest loan programs. And those costs would have to be funded through traditional revenue bonds that tend to carry a slightly higher interest rate, but again, are commonly used for financing of infrastructure projects. The last point on this slide is to note that the costs we've presented for the infrastructure improvements have been calculated based on current 2020 construction costs. Obviously, many of these improvements will not be built until the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. So it's important in the overall financial analysis to consider escalation and how those costs will go up. So the costs shown here in the blue column and the red column are the escalated cost estimated at the midpoint of construction for each of the alternatives. So again, these are large programs with significant capital requirements. But Joliet has taken large steps forward in securing funding and positioning itself for attractive financing for implementation of the program. So we've talked about all this from the standpoint of the program, but what does this mean for the residents of Joliet? So before we jump into that, I thought it was important to take just a minute and review what the typical utility bill that the residents in Joliet receive includes. As shown on the chart on the left, the typical bill out for utility services in Joliet includes costs associated with the water system, the provision of water, the sewer system, dealing with the collection and disposal of wastewater, and also the collection of garbage and refuse in the community. So under current conditions in 2020, and based on a typical amount of water use for a residential customer in Joliet, that total bill amounts to about $100, with the water component of it being about $34 of that total. So it's important because as we go forward, we'll talk about how this program would affect the water component of that bill only. The chart I'm showing here again uses the blue and red theme. So the blue bars or columns are related to the Chicago Department of Water Management 30 MGD alternative. The red columns are related to the Indiana intake alternative. And these show one pattern of rate increases, water rate increases that would be required to fund the program and how that varies between the two alternatives over time. So you see this does require a period of years starting very soon with relatively high rate increases in the range of 10 to 12% to provide the funding necessary for the program. As you get further out into the program, the rate increases begin to drop off a little bit for the Chicago alternative, given that there's less capital and less debt service associated with that alternative. By the time you get out to 2035 or 2036, when the costs have basically been financed, then those rate increases drop off to more of a maintenance level. If you look at what is the impact of those rate increases on the average monthly water bill, this chart shows going from the left in 2020, the current typical water bill, as we've mentioned before, the water component is about $34 a month for a customer in Joliet. With that program of rate increases that was shown on the prior slide, those rates would go up. By 2030, the rates would be in the range of $90 to $93 a month for a typical household. By 2040, the rates would be out in the range of about $143 to $149. Under the 30 MGD scenario, the rates are slightly higher for the new Indiana intake alternative. When you look at the 60 MGD regional scenario, and again, look at the costs that are allocated to Joliet and customers in Joliet, again, you see the pattern of rate increases. Here by 2030, the typical bill for Chicago, for the Chicago alternative in Joliet would be about $79 per month. And the typical bill to a Joliet resident for the Indiana intake alternative would be about $75 per month. So in this case, in the larger regional program, the cost for the Chicago alternative is slightly higher. When you get out to 2040, that pattern continues, with the Chicago alternative being at about $123 per month, the Indiana intake alternative being at about $112 per month. Lastly, one of the other metrics that we've used over the course of this program to compare the alternatives is the 50-year total cost of water. So this is really an exercise through which we combine all the costs, the one-time costs, the annual costs, the debt service costs of each alternative over the 50-year life of the program, and then account for the time value of money. So there is some allowance that costs that occur later in the program are discounted back to a present value. When we combine all of those costs and compare the two alternatives, for the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative at 30 MGD, we're at about $1.63 billion for that overall alternative. For the Indiana intake alternative, we're at about $1.53 billion. One of the important things to note from this slide is the difference in the components that make up that total cost of water. For the Chicago alternative, the dark blue lower portion of the column is the cost of purchasing water from the city of Chicago. So over time, there's a significant cost to purchase that treated water from Chicago. The lighter blue portion at the top part of the bar, or in the middle part, if you will, is the capital cost and debt service associated with the infrastructure required to bring the water to Joliet. And then there's a very small sliver at the top that is really the operation, maintenance, and replacement costs. And effectively, those are the costs associated with operating the new pumping facilities that would be required to bring the water to Joliet. When you look at the Indiana alternative, the distribution is slightly different. The bottom part of the column is primarily associated with capital costs and debt service. There is much more infrastructure that has to be built for the Indiana intake alternative. There is no cost for the purchase of water. The water access costs associated with the Indiana intake alternative are actually relatively small in the overall scheme of things. The top part of the Indiana column shows the operation and maintenance costs for that alternative. And again, these are significantly greater than the Chicago operation and maintenance costs because we do have a new intake, a new water treatment plant, as well as the pumping facilities. So while the overall costs over a 50-year period are relatively close, there are differences in the components that make up those two costs. So I provided you with a lot of numbers and costs. I'm going to turn it over to Allison now and let her walk you through the discussion of the business case for each alternative, the risk analysis, and the next steps that need to be taken. Sorry, we're having some trouble with the slides moving around, so I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Joe and Teresa, for the information that you've provided about the two alternatives and the associated costs. So now I'm going to wrap up the presentation by discussing the risks and the business case for the alternatives, and then the next steps in the selection process and how you can get involved. So for both of the alternatives, a risk analysis was completed, which consisted of risks identified by not only the project team, but also the City Council and the public. So a major goal of the work that we did in 2020 was to find ways to mitigate these risks. So on this slide, we've identified risks that are related to the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, and these can be boiled down into four major categories. The first is related to the agreement terms and conditions. One risk that's frequently been discussed with this alternative is the risk that Chicago could potentially sell the water system to a private entity. We feel we've mitigated this risk by adding a statement into the preliminary agreement that Chicago will not sell the water system without approval from Joliet. Another risk identified is a change in administration. So it's important to note that this agreement is anticipated to be signed next fall, fall of 2021, and is for a term of 50 years, which would secure the terms of the agreement for that duration. So in that way, we feel we have addressed that risk. The next category of risk is related to control. And control can refer to many things: operation and treatment of the water treatment facility, quality of the finished water, and the setting of water rates. So Chicago has made major commitments in the preliminary agreement to address issues related to this topic, specifically the advisory council and the wholesale water rate. However, the decision on capital improvements, treatment processes, and rate setting ultimately will be made by the Chicago City Council. The next category is related to aged infrastructure. So while Chicago has demonstrated that they have conducted maintenance and ongoing investment in their infrastructure, it is still over 70 years old. In addition, the current treatment process does not allow for the removal of currently known emerging contaminants, such as PFAS. And if those are regulated in their future, there could be significant capital improvements that would be needed. However, the city has done water quality monitoring, which shows levels of contaminants are currently below those contemplated limits. And however, it is unknown what limits may be required in the future. The last risk category is related to land acquisition. So as mentioned, real estate for facilities within Chicago has been identified, and there does not appear to be any obstacles to obtaining the needed easements. However, we will need to obtain right-of-way and real estate for the intermediate pump station and transmission main. We feel that these risks associated with that acquisition can be mitigated via the formation of the Water Commission, which will have land acquisition rights not afforded to the city alone. So next, we completed a SWOT analysis, and we've identified the top items from each category on this slide. A more in-depth analysis is provided in the prospectus documents. So the key strength identified is that with this alternative, Chicago provides high-quality water to millions of people for over 100 years. However, a weakness is the city would no longer have control over water treatment and purchased water costs. There is a significant opportunity to join with Chicago and their other wholesale customers in a regional water system, but there are significant unknowns that are beyond Joliet's control that could impact costs, such as replacement of aging infrastructure, treatment for emerging contaminants, and loss of existing customers. I apologize, I'm having a problem advancing the screen. There we go. Okay, a similar risk analysis and SWOT analysis was also performed for the Indiana alternative. And similar to the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, we identified 4 major categories of risk. The first is related to crossing state lines. And we recognize that there is added complexity to permitting requirements, and there's also risk associated with the potential that our Lake Michigan application could be disputed, or that legislation could be passed which would limit the ability to convey water across state lines. However, through the efforts of our government advocacy team, we have not recognized any current significant threats related to this issue. The next major category is related to the magnitude of the improvements. This project has significant capital costs, as Joe identified, and also very complex construction sequencing. So there is concern that a risk is associated with potential from any issues that would delay construction and not allow the city to meet its 2030 goal of having water online. There's also a significant debt burden associated with this alternative, which we feel the Water Commission format would help mitigate this risk by distributing that debt amongst multiple entities. The third category of risk is related to operations. Joliet would have significant responsibility and liability for operating and maintaining a water treatment facility. This would include source water monitoring and specifically addressing any raw water quality issues. The industries located in northwestern Indiana along the south shoreline of Lake Michigan at times has been prone to spills or other discharges into the lake. When these have occurred, we feel this risk has been mitigated through cooperation with the City of Hammond, which is currently written into the preliminary agreement that we would work together on source water monitoring. Furthermore, the city could turn off its intake and rely on the very large delay in the conveyance of raw water to the treatment facility, and at that point rely on its water storage until the contamination issue had passed. This alternative also requires additional staffing and training of that staff to operate a water treatment facility. We feel that bringing staff early in the process and training them over the next 10 years would allow for a smooth transition and operation of a surface water treatment facility. The last risk category is associated with land acquisition. While we have not secured land within Hammond for the shore facilities, we have identified 3 feasible, technically feasible alternatives. So we do feel there is flexibility in acquiring that land. Similarly to the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, we would rely on the abilities of the Water Commission to secure rights of ways in Illinois and on the agreement that was negotiated with Hammond for use of right-of-way in Indiana. So we also performed the SWOT analysis, and we've identified here the major strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So with the Indiana alternative, we would have complete control over the improvements, including the schedule, water treatment, and operation of the system and rate setting. However, this alternative is very complex, and the magnitude of construction is very significant. We have an opportunity to work with Hammond for a long-term on source water monitoring, but there is always the threat for potential challenges to interstate use of water. So really going to try and sum up both of these alternatives and all of the work that was done in 2020 into 2 slides and present the business case. So with the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, Joliet would be a wholesale customer of Chicago and pay a wholesale water rate. With this alternative, the city will benefit from the use of Chicago's existing water treatment plant and will not be responsible or liable for plant operation. Joliet would give up control over water production and rate setting, and the city's system is aged and does not treat for emerging contaminants. However, we have the opportunity to leverage the knowledge and water supply expertise of the City of Chicago and benefit from participation in a large regional water system. For the new Indiana intake alternative, it's a very bold plan with construction of over $1 billion of infrastructure. With this plan, the city would have the responsibility and liability for designing, constructing, and operating this infrastructure. We would have a long-term, over 99-year relationship with Hammond, Indiana for access. This alternative provides brand new infrastructure, which would not require significant improvements for 50+ years. In addition, we would have control of water treatment and would utilize an advanced water treatment process that could treat for known emerging contaminants. The magnitude of the improvements are significant, and there are added complexities due to crossing state lines. However, this alternative offers the city complete control over program implementation, operations, and rate setting. So the city is fortunate that has 2 very good alternatives to consider. This will definitely not be an easy decision for the city council. This slide shows a roadmap for the next 2 months. In the first 2 weeks of December, we are focusing on obtaining public comments via the 2 live meetings that are being held today and tomorrow, as well as the online virtual event, which is going on through the 14th. The project team is also working on providing supplemental information that will dive deeper into comparing the 2 alternatives. On December 17th, we will host a City Council workshop at which we will present the comparison information and have representatives from the City of Chicago and City of Hammond available to show their support and answer questions. In January, the City Council will formally vote to select one of the alternatives. So as you can tell from the presentation, there's a lot of work that needs to be performed during the next 10 years. 2021 is a very critical year with many significant milestones that must be met. So it's imperative that a water source be selected in January to ensure that the new water source is online by 2030. So I just really want to encourage everyone to please participate, provide your comments, tell your neighbors and family to view the information that's available online at the website. And we will be compiling all of the comments and forwarding them to the City Council for their consideration when making the selection. You can provide comments in 5 ways: by commenting today at the virtual meeting, by providing a comment on the website via the online virtual event. You can also email rethinkwater@joliet.gov or call us directly at 815-724-4220. And so with that, I will just encourage everyone one more time to please visit our website where we have posted all of the program materials at rethinkwaterjoliet.org. And at this time, I will turn it over to Jeff, who will moderate the question and answer session.
Okay, great. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Allison, Joe, and Teresa for a fantastic presentation on the alternatives. As Allison has stated, now is the time that we're jumping into Q&A as well as the public comments. Just as a reminder, you can add questions to the questions pane, or again, comments to the pane as well, by typing your question into the box at the bottom after you touch the Q&A button. We actually already have several that are within there, but we do have about a half hour reserved for this period, so certainly are willing and can take more questions and comments, and we'll get to them in the order that they were submitted. So with that, here's your panelists again. They're all going to unmute themselves and we can get going with the questions and comments. First up is, does the 60 MGD pipe include potential growth for the area communities? And we're going to have Teresa take that one.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So as part of the 2020 evaluation, we looked at the pipe sizing. We also looked at the demands of not only Joliet, but the regional communities up to 2050, and based on CMAP projections. We looked at, and that's what the 30 and 60 MGD scenario are based on, but we also did consider the fact that there could be growth beyond 2050 because not only Joliet, but other communities are growing beyond that. So we've sized that transmission main, the 48-inch or 60-inch, depending on whether it's a 30 MGD or 60 MGD alternative. That has been sized based on minimum pipe velocities. So we can increase the velocity in the pipe and adjust the pumping to accommodate a higher demand if needed. So the final sizing decision for the infrastructure will not be made until January of 2022 prior to final design, and will be dependent on not only the projected future growth of communities, but also which communities would join the regional solution.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Second up, it's actually got a couple questions all in one, so we're going to break it up a little bit here. What are the conservation measures? And the other question related to that is, what about reusing wastewater? Allison, could you respond to that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm glad someone asked a question about water conservation because the city has made major strides in the past few years to really put an emphasis on water conservation. We've formed a water conservation subcommittee that meets monthly. They actually have a meeting this afternoon. It's the first Wednesday of every month. From that committee, there's been a number of recommendations that have been implemented, such as a low-flow toilet rebate program, as well as a rain barrel subsidy program. So we've had a lot of success over the last 2 years of really encouraging residents to conserve water through those programs. We've also focused a lot of our educational campaigns on everyday water conservation measures, and those are being sent out via social media and also posted on the city's billboards. As part of our Lake Michigan allocation application, we've committed to reducing our non-revenue water to less than 10% by 2040. So in practical terms, that means that we're going to be increasing our water main replacement program. For the past 5 years, we focused on replacement of 1% of our water mains. With this new commitment for water conservation and the Lake Michigan allocation, we are going to be increasing that replacement to 1.6%. This equates to almost a $16 million annual commitment by the city to reducing water loss. We've also added to our ordinances the IDNR required water conservation ordinances related to outdoor water use, metering requirements, and other measures that are required for Lake Michigan water users. So that answers the water conservation component. I'm also excited to discuss the plans we have for reusing wastewater. We have been in discussions with local industries about using our wastewater effluent in lieu of relying on groundwater for cooling water purposes at local industry. So we are in very active talks to use that and be able to reuse our wastewater.
All right, thank you, Allison. Another part of that question was, why not take water from the Des Plaines instead of building a pipe to Lake Michigan? Let's have Teresa take that one.
Thank you, Jeff. So as part of the phase 1 study that was done in 2018, we did look at all different potential sources of water, including the Des Plaines River. It's right there running through the city. So it was evaluated as a potential water source. We talked to IEPA, which is the regulator in Illinois for drinking water, about using the Des Plaines River as the raw water source. And there was concerns given the fact that it's not used currently as a drinking water source, and the fact that there is stormwater and wastewater discharges to the Des Plaines River upstream of Joliet that would impact the raw water quality. And as such, there would be a significant amount of proving that it could work. And then on top of that, there would be advanced treatment, more than what we're talking about here. And so it was determined not to be feasible based on the relatively low water quality.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. The next one is actually, there's a couple comments that are on the same topic. So first of all, hello, is a P3 delivery approach being considered for the project? Also related to that, P3 is an opportunity or potential for innovation for cost saving, push capital cost risks to private sector for cost certainty, O&M efficiencies and reduce costs, state of good repair over lifetime of the system. And then also Joliet could retain rights to set water rates through P3 if that's a priority. So going back to a number of those obviously were statements, but the initial question is a P3 delivery approach being considered for the project. Joe, can you take that one, please?
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So early on, we recognized that this would be a major project and that there might be opportunities for P3 involvement, a public-private partnership as part of the program. During the phase 2 effort, there was an RFI process where Joliet sought to gather information from both potential water suppliers and parties that might be interested in participating in a P3. That was really an effort just to kind of gather some background information. But to date, really through the balance of the phase 2 study and the work this year, the city's focus has been on getting to the point of doing an objective comparison of the two alternatives and getting to a point where a decision can be made as to which alternative is the best for bringing Lake Michigan water to Joliet. As you can imagine, Joliet has a hard deadline here in terms of 2030, so there is concern about Joliet maintaining control of the overall schedule and being able to manage the risk to the schedule of getting this project implemented. And there have been discussions about the level of control that Joliet wants to maintain over various components of the project. Having said that, as part of the contracting plans that were developed this year, it was recognized that there will be value once an alternative is selected in looking at the individual components of the project and trying to figure out where might alternative delivery methods or potential P3 involvement on specific projects or specific projects within the overall program make sense. So so it is out there. The council has been briefed on how P3s work and how that fits in. But at this point of the process, we focused on providing an objective comparison with the approach that Joliet would implement either alternative on its own.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I guess, I've stated I'm going to read the comments as they lie. So I'm going to do that, whether they're specific to the project or the presentation with a particular comment on this one. It was a great presentation, followed with a question of, does the OM&R estimate account for the current infrastructure and its future requirements? So Joe, you're back up for that one.
No, perfect. Thanks. Good question. So the OM&R numbers, values that were shown in this presentation are specific to the improvements associated with the project, but the financial analysis that was used to develop the rate trajectories and rate forecasts does include the city's existing capital improvement program for other improvements required within the water system and OM&R costs associated with operating and maintaining its existing infrastructure. I guess one note to just point out on that front is with either of these alternatives, the city will dramatically reduce its reliance on its deep wells. The power costs associated with operating those deep wells is significant. So there's actually a credit that's been included in the analysis to account for the fact that the energy costs associated with running the current system will be reduced as Joliet moves off the deep wells to the new system. So the values presented in the analysis are specific to the new improvements, but the OM&R for the existing system has been considered in the overall financial analysis.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Next question is, what percentage of the funding will come from revenue bonds? And Joe, you're back up for that one. Or is that the one you just answered? No.
No. That's, yeah, we can take that. No, thanks, Jeff. As I think there was a slide in the presentation where we showed the funding strategy. And so the current funding strategy is that 49% of the project or the program costs would be financed through the WIFIA program, that the SRF program would provide up to $250 million. And then the balance would be the revenue bonds. I'll be honest, I don't have the percentages off the top of my head. We can certainly run those numbers and provide them in the responses. But basically the revenue bonds would be used to finance the balance after 49% is processed through WIFIA, and another $50 million a year for 5 years, or $250 million is financed through low interest loans with the state EPA through the revolving fund.
All right, thanks, Joe. I hope you have a glass of water there because we got a couple more for you. What would the monthly cost be? Would the Chicago plan allow Joliet to resell the water?
So let me answer the second part first, because that's a little more clear to me. But yes, in the discussions of both alternatives would allow for the formation of a regional water commission where water would be brought to Joliet and then distributed to multiple parties. There was discussion, as Allison referenced earlier this year, with the city council, and Joliet's approach to the regional option right now would be to form a water commission where there would be multiple parties that would join together, form the commission, and they would all purchase water from that commission. The option of Joliet being, say, a wholesaler of water to other customers was discussed early on, but there were a number of factors considered that prompted the city to look more at a water commission approach, including some provisions that help out in terms of land acquisition and right-of-way during planning and design and construction of the project. So, but either alternative could support a regional solution. And then in terms of the monthly cost, that one's a little less clear. Certainly, I think as we've outlined on the Chicago alternative, Joliet would have to purchase treated water from Chicago, and that would be the rate would be calculated based on a cost of service analysis each year, and Joliet would pay that money out to Chicago to purchase the treated water. And then as outlined in the access agreement with Hammond, there are some ongoing costs associated with use of their right-of-way. So those are the recurring costs that Joliet would incur for the supply. The monthly cost to residents would be those rates that we showed on the charts based on a typical residential water bill. So I'd encourage you to, that information is in the prospectus documents, it's in the presentation materials posted, and lots of detail there around what the likely monthly rates would be.
Okay, thank you, Joe. You got a little bit of rest here for at least one. This question or statement is, it seems short-sighted to consider only the 30 MGD pipe in construction. It will cost a fortune to rebuild. So Teresa, do you want to comment on the considerations related to 30 MGD pipe?
Yeah, so probably wasn't clear when I responded previously on the design. For both the 30 MGD pipe, which is the 48-inch pipe, we looked at minimum velocities for that as well. And so we actually looked at Joliet's potential build-out population for the 30 MGD scenario to make sure that the 48-inch pipe would be sufficient to supply the demand of Joliet by just adding additional intermediate pump stations. So we could add 2 more intermediate pump stations instead of just the one, and end up doubling the capacity of that 48-inch pipe. So we've considered that, and that will again be factored in further with the regional scenario and talking to our regional communities about build out populations for the 60 MGD scenario. So for the 30 MGD scenario, the transmission main has been accounted for, and by adding increasing capacity, adding a couple of intermediate pump stations, and then the other facilities would be constructed to allow for growth as needed.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Statement and then a question. Kudos to the team for a great job summarizing the results of a great deal of work. I'm curious to know if environmental costs were considered in evaluating the 2 alternatives. Example, carbon footprint of brand new infrastructure, both in material manufacturing as well as actual construction of facilities for Hammond versus reuse of existing facilities and presumably fewer newer structures for the Chicago option. So Joe, would you like to address that one, please?
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So there has not been a carbon footprint calculation done for the 2 alternatives. Certainly there is a difference in the amount of infrastructure that's required to be built. What has been done from the environmental standpoint, I think two perspectives. One, in looking at the pumping costs for the 2 alternatives. Both alternatives have been analyzed, and then we've looked at the pumping requirements associated to bring the water from Lake Michigan all the way out to Joliet and deliver it. And those have been calculated and turned into or incorporated into the operating maintenance and replacement costs associated with both alternatives. And then separately on a slightly different front, but related to the environmental issues, as the routing studies have been performed for the transmission main, a key part of that analysis was to identify potential areas where environmental considerations might impact potential alignments, and to make sure that we had a representative alignment for the transmission main that included an appropriate amount of pipeline, basically length of pipeline and routing, so that cost was accurately predicted. Once an alternative is selected and the city moves forward, I would expect during preliminary design that initial reviews, either using the Envision framework or the LEED framework, perhaps not necessarily pursuing certification, but to look at the overall project and identify areas where we could make sure to provide for efforts to make the project as sustainable and resilient as possible.
Thank you, Joe. Next question, how about using wastewater to water golf courses? Allison, could you take that one, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So the city owns and operates 3 wastewater treatment plants. And as part of our ongoing efforts with our wastewater treatment plants, we have investigated the use of wastewater effluent for watering of golf courses. Unfortunately, there are no golf courses that are within a close enough proximity that would make that feasible. So it's something we'll continue to monitor, but at this time, it's not something that we're pursuing further.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple more questions. We'll continue to go through that, but we still have about 13 minutes left. So if you have questions or comments that are coming to mind, please do put those in the Q&A panel so that we can read those as part of the record here. If things come up later, you can certainly then post them online throughout that process, but if we can address them today for you, that would probably be ideal. So next item is a comment. This person had got on a little bit late and was asking about the recording, if that would be available. And then another question was, how about the slides? Both the recording of this webinar and the slides will be posted on the Rethink Water Joliet website, possibly even later today. If not today, certainly tomorrow. So you'll be able to access them again, both the recording as well as the slides. As stated throughout the presentation, there is a second public forum tomorrow. It will end up being a very similar presentation, but certainly could be different comments. You're certainly free to participate in that one tomorrow evening, which starts at 6:30. That also will be recorded and posted online too. Next question then, could Joliet sell water to other towns if we paid more to build? For instance, Lockport, Crest Hill, New Lenox, Shorewood, etc. So Allison, you want to take that one?
Thanks, Jeff. As we've mentioned throughout this afternoon, a regional solution is something that the city is very committed to, and we have been meeting with the communities that were asked about to see if they would be interested in partnering with the city in the Water Commission. So the direction we received in August from the City Council is that we would proceed with the Water Commission format based on the outreach we had done this summer with communities. There was a lot more interest from those communities in participating in a commission approach rather than as a Joliet selling the water to them. So we are going to be continuing the work to form that Water Commission. And as Teresa had mentioned, we really won't be, sizing the facilities until January of 2022. So at that time, we should know who is going to be participating and what size the facilities will be constructed, what demands the facilities will be constructed to meet.
Great, thank you, Allison. All right, another question here related to the monthly cost. So this person is asking, will the monthly cost be about $150 total? And that would be Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, just if I go back to the slide, so what we've presented, and again, I should be clear, the forecasts of water rate increases that are presented here are hypothetical. Obviously, the Joliet City Council has the final decision on water rates within the community, but we developed rate trajectories really to show what would a typical pattern be that would be required to fund either of the alternatives. And yes, if you look out at the slides we presented, looking out to 2040, so looking 20 years in the future, for the 30 MGD option, The monthly bill for the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative would be about $143 a month for a typical residential user, and for the new Indiana intake would be $149 per month. Those go down again with the 60 MGD alternative with the economies of scale. So those 2040 numbers are about $123 a month for Chicago and about $112 a month for the new Indiana intake. So so that's the range of estimated average bills 20 years out in the future.
Okay, we've got another one here. Looks like actually a number of people could probably answer it. We'll start out with Joe, and then if anybody wants to add to it. Can you elaborate on the steps needed for obtaining a Great Lakes diversion approval for the Hammond option? And actually, Joe, if you want me to add some to that, I certainly could as well.
I'll start it out, and Jeff, if you want to then go through the details a little bit more. But I guess that I think the key point to make here is that so with either of these alternatives, Joliet is required to have a Lake Michigan allocation permit from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So any community located within Illinois that's using Lake Michigan water is required to have an allocation permit. Those permits are issued by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And that process, and Jeff can talk about this in a moment, is underway. As Allison mentioned, the city has submitted its permit application, and pre-hearing is set for December 21st on that process. Beyond that, there is a structure I think people are aware of within the Great Lakes. There's a framework called the Great Lakes Compact that governs diversions from the Great Lakes and was put in place in particular to protect the overall Great Lakes system. Illinois is a party to that compact and contributed to its development. But it is important to note that when the compact was prepared, there was recognition that Illinois already had an established program in place for managing its allocation. So the amount of water that Illinois communities can withdraw from Lake Michigan is set based on a Supreme Court ruling that was originally passed down in 1967, has been updated, I believe, in 1980. And that sets the limit in terms of the amount of water that could be withdrawn from Lake Michigan by communities in Illinois. And that is the program that the Illinois DNR manages. So they manage, they're responsible for managing withdrawals in Illinois and maintaining them within that limit. As a result of the existence of that program, the Great Lakes Compact exempts Illinois communities that are covered by the Illinois program from the requirements of the overall Great Lakes Compact. So the idea was they already have a structured program that they're being regulated under. So the primary steps for Joliet, regardless of which alternative they go with, are all tied to the process of obtaining their Lake Michigan allocation permit. So yeah, Jeff, I don't know whether you or Teresa want to add on to that in terms of status of where we are.
I can provide a little bit, and then Teresa can add to it. So as Joe stated, the first step is the pre-hearing process. The whole process is managed by a hearing officer from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. That pre-hearing meeting, as Joe stated, is on the 21st of this month, where the application will be reviewed and then testimony will be given. After the pre-hearing, then it goes to the actual hearing, which is probably 1 to 2 months out in time, where the hearing officer will again hear comments related to the application. The hearing officer will then develop their opinion based on what they've heard, pass that opinion on to the director of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and ultimately the director of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources would issue the permit. The consultant team, which includes legal counsel, is confident the permit request meet for both of the alternatives, meets all the applicable regulations that Joe has mentioned, and we have had initial comments from IDNR staff that also agree with that assessment. So we'll go through the process, but ultimately there's a high level of confidence, whether it's connection to the city of Chicago or a new withdrawal from Indiana intake, will be permitted. Does anybody else want to add anything on that one, or shall we move on to the next one?
I think you guys covered it well.
All right, thank you. So next question, comment. Do you anticipate any difficulties in obtaining access easements rights through the multiple suburban communities under either option? And if a hurdle were to arise, would that require pursuit of a significantly different route? And Teresa is going to take that one.
Yeah, so thank you, Jeff. One part of the 2020 evaluation that we spent a significant amount of time on was routing studies, and that's for the transmission main, basically getting from the source to Joliet. And that was done for both alternatives. And as part of that, and that went into some of the permitting plan information I talked about, we did reach out to communities that we were going through to have initial discussions with them on routing through their community. So that outreach has been made as part of the 2020 evaluation, and we anticipate that that would continue into 2021 into preliminary design. So right now at this point, we haven't come across any roadblocks so far. So, but we did with the routing also look at the corridor, basically a mile either side of the route, in order to look at other possible streets and right-of-ways and corridors that the transmission main could go down. So there is some flexibility in that, so that even if it had to move off the current route slightly, it wouldn't impact the overall cost, that there are options in going through from the source to Joliet.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. And we're closing in on the 2:30 time frame here. We've got one more question, so we'll take that one and then have the closing comments. If you do end up submitting a question before the webinar ends, it will be part of the response that will be put on the online overall. So if you want to ask it, certainly go ahead, but we'll address it separately. So the last question of this afternoon is, if Joliet stops withdrawing water from the aquifer, will this allow the suburban Joliet communities to continue to draw water from underground? Allison, would you like to take that one, please?
Yeah, so the city is part of the Southwest Water Planning Group, which is a number of communities as well as industry that are in the Southwest suburban area. And through that group, the Illinois State Water Survey has done updated groundwater modeling. And this question is one that they specifically addressed. So within their modeling, they have a scenario that shows Joliet going off the aquifer in 2030. And what they found is that there is a slight rebound, but then the aquifer quickly starts to decline again. So it's simply not sustainable for the current water usage or the future growth of other communities and the uses for industry in the area. So the exact time that other communities will need to transition to an alternative water source was work that the State Water Survey did as part of the Southwest Water Planning Group. So that was presented to each community, and that's something that they will have to look at in the decision that they make whether or not to join with Joliet in the new Lake Michigan water system. But no, we want to be very clear that Joliet switching off the aquifer does not solve the problem for the other communities around us.
All right, thank you, Allison. And thanks again to Joe and Teresa for your presentation today. Thanks for everybody for your comments and questions throughout the forum. Like has been presented throughout here, there are other options to provide comments. Certainly you can get a lot of information at the Rethink Water Joliet website with the address there on the screen. There is the other public forum tomorrow night. Overall, we do have a summary that is online that includes this information as well as many other things on the website. So with that, we're going to shut down the webinar for today. Again, thank you everybody and have a good rest of your day.